This is really the part we tend to talk about the most in our campus budget committees. And this is the portion of the budget that's tied to instruction and support, student services, campus infrastructure. And this is made up of state appropriation and tuition primarily. And there's also some restrictions on how it can be used. So part of the reason we have those auxiliaries is because we can't necessarily do all of those functions within the university operating fund. But let's dive into that piece a little bit more. There's really 4 primary funding sources within the university operating fund. We have our state general fund allocation, tuition, other fees, and then cost recovery and other revenue. And I'm going to get into each piece of this pie a little bit. You can see we have approximate shares, approximate proportions of the revenue. Those proportions may fluctuate up or down by 1% or 2% in each year, but generally our slices of the pie remain the same year over year. So we might get a little bit more general fund allocation, but our tuition increases at the same time. And so these proportions don't generally change too much. But let's dive in with the big one, state appropriation. So our general funds appropriation is about 50% of our university operating fund budget, about half. And this is what we get from the state. This is what we tend to focus on a lot throughout the year when we're having discussions about the budget process. And the state allocation also has an impact on campus enrollment. So typically when we receive that funding from the state, they give us an enrollment target, which kind of dictates the other revenue portions of our budget as well. And that state appropriation process spans over a year. We'll get into that a little bit more in a few slides. But generally, those changes in the general fund allocation are outlined in the Budget Act, and that must be signed by the governor by June 30th. And the Budget Act often ties funding to specific uses or outcomes, such as enrollment growth or basic needs support. And then the Chancellor's Office often further designates the purpose of that funding. And this is an important piece that I try to remind folks of as many opportunities as I have to do so. Because the general fund makes up about half of our budget, whenever we talk about changes to the general fund, that's half of our total budget. So if we're looking at a 5% general fund increase, it's only a 2.5% increase for our total budget. If we were to go the other way and looking at a 5% decrease in our state budget, that would be about a 2.5% decrease for our total campus, the total system. So as promised, I was going to go into the timeline related to our state general fund allocation. So typically spring and summer, the Chancellor's Office, the CSU as a whole, as a system, begins their budget planning. And they start looking at, talking to campuses, what are the needs, where do we need additional funding and support? And our campus is advocating for funding based on needs and priorities, but they're really gathering a lot of information in anticipation of making their ask. So the system actually makes their request through the Board of Trustees. The trustees adopt the CSU budget request and then submit that request to the governor. And this happens in September. It used to happen in November, but that timeline was moved up to allow more time for advocacy. And typically this request is pretty specific and it outlines proposed increases. And I would say this is not so much a request, this is a wish list. And this is our opportunity to say, this is what we're doing for the system. This is what we're doing for our students. We need more resources. With more resources, we could do X, Y, Z. I think in my 15 years, I've seen a request fully funded one time. So very rarely do we look at this as anything other than a wish list. This is not really something we can start planning our budget around because it very rarely is it ever funded. So we're doing a lot of work kind of on the back end. As I mentioned, there's some advocacy that's happening with legislators in Sacramento. But January is our first piece of really concrete news, I guess I would say. This is when the governor releases his preliminary budget to the legislature. And like I said, it is preliminary. There is a lot that can happen between January and June, but it does start to signal where priorities are at, and it starts to signal the economic state of the state of California. So this is typically when we'll start our preliminary planning. And there's usually a lot of scenarios in there because a lot can change. I often remind folks that there was a fully funded request almost in January of 2020. And by the time we hit sort of the next phase of our budget timeline, that looked drastically different. So we're not necessarily making decisions at this point, but we do start planning based on the direction that budget is going. So February is when the Legislative Analyst's Office, we will sometimes refer to the LAO, they release their budget analysis. This is separate from the governor's office, so it's a different perspective on what they think can be funded. And this is when we're really moving forward with advocacy, and it's done at the CSU level by the chancellor's office. It's done by the students through CSSA, which is their advocacy group. It's done through CFA for faculty. CSUEU is advocating. The campuses are working with their local state representatives. So there's a lot of advocacy to sort of move in a direction closer to that wish list that we submitted once we know what the governor's priorities are. In May, the governor releases his or hers revised budget. This is still not the final budget, but most of the substantial changes are reflected here. And then in June, the state budget is adopted. This is still relatively recent in the history of funding the CSU, where we know we're going to have a signed budget in June before the new fiscal year starts. I remember many years of a September budget, a November budget, and then a number of years ago, the state of California decided that was not acceptable, and they were going to start docking legislators' pay for every day that they did not have an approved budget. And then magically, ever since then, we have had a signed budget on June 30th. And at that point, the chancellor's office will then prepare to distribute the funding to campuses. It is worth noting that this is the timeline we have to follow because it aligns with the state budget timeline. That being said, this is not necessarily consistent with our planning. There are a lot of inputs here that do not align with the information that we have. So some examples are when we make that budget request in September, usually we don't have finalized bargaining agreements. So there's a compensation request without knowing what that need is. When we have funding finalized in June, if there's enrollment growth, well, we've already admitted our students for fall. You know, we don't necessarily have time to hire tenure track faculty between fall if we are able to increase that enrollment. And so there's definitely some misalignment between how we function as a university and as a system and what the state timeline is. But this is really, you can see how the money funnels through. We have the state of California budget, and then it's allocated to higher education. The CSU makes up about 22% of that higher education budget. They don't necessarily always give us, 22%. They do allocate to the three branches differently, but this is relatively consistent year over year. And then San Diego State makes about 7% of the total CSU budget. So the chancellor's office distributes funding to the campus based on different methodologies. And it really depends on the funding we get from the state, how that is designated. So sometimes they might allocate compensation based on our share of the total compensation pool. They've given out graduation initiative money based on our percent of Pell eligible students, if you look at the CSU system. So enrollment this year, the funding was distributed based on campuses that were able to take on additional students and those that weren't. And so when we receive funding, it's not necessarily, once again, that we'll always get 7% of the new money. However, in our initial planning, that tends to be what we use. And the CSU budget is so big that when we look at that incremental piece year over year, we still are in about a 7% range. So that's the state allocation, quite a bit. And now you understand, especially with all those steps, we do tend to talk about it a lot at every one of those, you know, the Board of Trustees meeting, the January preliminary budget, the May revised budget. We tend to talk a lot about what those changes look like, but it is not our entire budget. About a quarter of the university operating fund is funded through tuition. And tuition is charged per student. So the amount of tuition revenue collected is based on enrollment. So back in the state appropriation, I mentioned that, you know, we are assigned an enrollment target for our California resident students. That comes from the state and then to the chancellor's office. They are giving us a certain amount of funding to teach California resident students. We do not tend to over-enroll because if we enroll more California students than our target, our goal that we are assigned, we do not receive any additional funding. But that enrollment number that's assigned with the state appropriation piece also impacts how much tuition we're collecting. Our campus does have a high demand, so we do also have a higher population of non-resident students compared to some of our other smaller campuses in the system. Those non-resident students, we collect tuition for them. They pay additional fees. So while we aren't receiving any state appropriation, they are fully paying their way, and it does not make any difference on our resident target. Oh, wouldn't you know it? I jumped ahead, of course. So tuition is set at the system-wide level. The Board of Trustees approve the tuition amount. And so it's set to reflect the needs of the CSU system as a whole, not individual campuses. So we might be able to make an argument on why the cost of living in San Diego is higher, but it really reflects the system as a whole, and the tuition is the same at every campus. So if you are a part-time undergraduate student here, you're going to pay the same amount as a part-time undergraduate student at Chico. Those tuition increases can only be approved by the Board of Trustees. There's no control over it at the campus level. And the Board of Trustees must comply with the Working Family Student Fee Transparency and Accountability Act, which requires consultation with statewide student associations and public comment, a mandatory 45-day period between introduction and action, and adequate notice of increases provided to students and their families. So this act really made sure that we're giving our students advance notice, allowing them to plan a little bit better with their families, and also leaving room for feedback from students before that decision is made. We recently, the Board of Trustees recently increased tuition for the first time in quite a number of years, a decade. And when they did so, they put in writing something that had always been our common practice, which is 1/3 of new tuition revenue generated is allocated to financial aid. It's called the State University Grant. We sometimes refer to it as SUG, but it is a set aside of that tuition that goes directly towards financial aid. About 60% of CSU students' tuition is fully covered by grants or waivers, and approximately 80% of all CSU students receive at least some financial aid. And so this SUG pool makes sure that as tuition increases, the financial aid available also increases to keep up with it for our students receiving aid. The next category, other fees and revenue. So this makes up about 17-ish%. Unlike tuition, which is set at the system level, our campus is able to set campus-based fees specific to the needs of the campus. There's also, as I mentioned, our non-resident students pay additional fees to the campus. So that's included in here as well. Those are a little bit more discretionary for the campus, but most of our fees are approved for a specific purpose and cannot be spent outside of that scope. So what I first opened with when we looked at enterprise and auxiliary funds, the same is true here with our fees on a smaller level. So one example is the student success fee is approved when it was approved by students. They voted on 90% of that funding would go towards faculty hiring to increase course sections, and 10% goes to academically related programs. So as we receive that revenue, we put it into those specific buckets so they can only be used for those purposes. Similarly, we have our student health center. All of the revenue related to that fee is spent within the fund just for the student health center. And then finally, the last piece of this is other revenue, cost recovery. This is the smallest portion. It's about 8-ish%. Per CSU policy, the University Operating Fund cannot provide services to our enterprise and auxiliary funds without being reimbursed for that work. As I mentioned, we do look at our budget holistically. We look at the campus activities holistically. There is a lot of benefit from and economies of scale from us utilizing the same services, but we have to make sure that we are charging those auxiliaries and enterprises back for that work so that we aren't subsidizing them. A common example is release time for faculty to support grants. So the grant must reimburse the faculty for that time. We collect so that their salary associated with working on that grant lives within the grant. We also do this for other similar services. For example, cashiering services. You know, housing does not have their own cashier's office. They utilize ours, and so we charge back for that so that we're fully recovering those costs.